You multiply the numbers inside the radical, so you get the square root of 81, which is 9. So what we're saying is the square root of 9 times the square root of 9 is 9. So we're going to jump to that. So the square root of 8 times the square root of 8 equals 8. So remember that, and we'll talk about it again in a minute. The square root of -1 is an imaginary number. We call it I. I squared is I times I, which means it's the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. So just like the beginning of this, the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 equals -1. So anytime you see I squared, you need to simplify and substitute in -1. I cubed can be written as I squared times I, because remember when the bases are the same and you multiply them, you add the exponents. For I squared, we substitute -1, so we get -1 times I, which we simplify to be -I. There's more than one way you could do I to the fourth. I like to do I squared times I squared. And then we substitute because I squared equals -1, and -1 times -1 is a positive 1. So I to the fourth equals 1. You can do I to the fifth more than one way. I did I to the fourth times I. And then I to the fourth equals 1. And we leave I as I. So it just simplifies to 1I, which is I. Then the way we will do I to the sixth is I squared times I squared times I squared. So you get -1 times -1 times -1, which equals -1. I made I to the seventh, I to the sixth times I. So we substitute in -1 for I to the sixth. We get -1 times I, which equals -I. Notice we already have all those answers. And what we have is all of our answers are either going to be I or -I or 1 or -1. And we just match them up. For I to the eighth, I did I to the fourth times I to the fourth. So that gives me 1 times 1. So I to the eighth equals 1. So you can split up each one to actually simplify them, but notice there's a pattern. So they just go as I, -1, -I, 1. I, -1, -I, 1. And then it just repeats. So we mostly just deal with I and I squared, and sometimes a little higher. Use that column on the right to substitute. So the complex number is a real number and imaginary number. When we add them, we just combine like terms. And the same thing when you subtract them. So just put the constants together and then the i's together. Be careful when you subtract, you have to distribute that negative. Whenever you multiply them, you have to be sure to use the distributive property. And then whenever you have I squared, you substitute -1 in, and then you combine like terms. Make sure you take the 7 times both the 8 and the -2i, and then you have to multiply the 3i by both the 8 and the -2i. So you use the distributive property, and then you substitute whenever you get I squared, and then you combine like terms.